Okay, cool. How do we see how many people there are, and how do we view the comment stream? This is all new
You
to us,
can,
folks. Oh, I've got it. I've got it.
yeah, so
Cool.
there's a comment stream in StreamYard, and you can also have the YouTube link open.
Okay.
Cool.
I'm just gonna trust you and Skulk to dictate to me while I'm busy going.
You've just
Yeah,
made
I'll
the
make sure
worst
that
mistake of your life.
I'll make sure that any questions are communicated if they come up, because there's a little
Cool.
bit of a delay with the StreamYard comments
Cool.
that
Okay.
come
All
in.
right. So first and foremost, thanks everyone for joining. This is the very first React Africa event. It's actually also the very first FedSci event for 2022. Had a bit of a rough start to the year. I got COVID and so forth, so things didn't necessarily go according to plan. So we're having our very first event in February. But also interesting and exciting. It's our 100th event. So that's really great. So for those of you that have been kind of following us for quite some time now, we've made it to 100. I don't know like how to even celebrate that, but I think also what's really cool about this, I think for me specifically, so Justin doesn't seem to be here, is that this, so for those of you that don't know, so we've kind of started this React Africa thing, kind of which Mandia is driving, which is kind of just exploring how kind of the React framework is being used within kind of South Africa, but also like other African countries and so forth. We, you know, there's a couple of communities in Nigeria and so forth that we kind of have a lot of like overlapping interests and so forth, specifically within the React and specifically GraphQL spaces and so forth. So the hope is here to also kind of have a bit of a broader kind of set of speakers beyond just like what we have in like South Africa, and kind of specifically focus on React and what people are building with React and so forth. And I think this is really cool for me because it's the very first kind of project where neither Justin or I are actually involved. And I think that's kind of where you start feeling like front-end development South Africa is becoming like an actual real thing and not just a hobby project of Justin and mine. So this is also very exciting for me. So with that being said, I can't attest to the quality of the content. That's on Mandia. I had no hand in what's going to happen tonight. So that's on Ben and Mandia. But yeah, like I think I just wanted to kind of say welcome to everyone in 2022. Like we're very much looking forward to loads of cool things that are going to happen this year, especially now with kind of COVID becoming less severe. We might look at doing some in-person things a bit later during the year and so forth again, which kind of feels like almost unthinkable at this point. So we might be doing like some hackathons and events again. Cool. But so with that out of the way, I am happy to hand over to Mandia. Let her introduce kind of React Africa a bit, tell you guys a bit about what it is, and also introduce Ben, who's actually, I think this is the third time you're speaking at Front-End Development South Africa, so you're quite a regular yourself as well. But yeah, with that being said, like Mandia, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction, Skulk. I'm just going to quickly share my screen while we talk. Hopefully StreamYard cooperates nicely. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. So first of all, welcome to our first React.Africa talk. I'm really excited that everyone's here, and I'm really excited that we're able to launch this new initiative. As Skulk said, we're focusing more on React specifically in a Pan-African context. So I'm hoping to have some speakers from Nigeria and some other countries presenting to us soon. Obviously, if anybody who's here today would like to do a talk, I'm always open to be contacted. You can reach me on ZATech, or you can just contact me through my email. It's mandiaru@gmail.com. So yeah, welcome to React Africa. We're also technically a part of FEDSA, but we are our own program. So you'll see we do have the FEDSA logo on our slides as well. So we're kind of like a sub-program of FEDSA. So just to go through a couple of points regarding tonight's event. First, I'd like to just thank our sponsors. We share some sponsors with FEDSA, but we also very specifically have Vulkan Labs sponsoring the React.Africa group. So a big thank you to them for making my work with the group possible and making this event possible to begin with. Please check them out if you want to. And then I'm also happy to announce that we have an OfferZen giveaway. Justin will be sharing the link to this either at some point during the talk or after the talk. So don't just join and then run off. Do stick around to get some cool swag. And then, yeah, this is our agenda for the evening. We've done some intros. We're going to have a great talk by Ben. We'll do a little dedicated Q&A session afterwards, and then we'll have the giveaway. So with that out of the way, let me introduce Ben. Ben is a very senior software engineer. I have the privilege of working with him at Vulkan Labs. He's one of the best React developers that I know, and he's also very interested in teaching and improving the knowledge of those around him. So I feel very privileged to work with him on a daily basis, and I'm sure that we're going to gain some really valuable insights from his talk this evening. Someone in the chat is just asking at other Ben, who is the first Ben?
Well, my thing is, in leadership, I try to take the back seat. So whichever Ben appears is allowed to be in front of me, encouraged to be in front of me.
Awesome. Well, with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Ben. So let me just stop sharing my screen, and then whenever you're ready, you can take us away.
Cool, let's do that. Share screen. Don't show these tips again. Maybe I should read the tips before I dismiss them. Okay, cool. Entire screen. Share, quickly go here before they see the StreamYard link.
We should have probably done a dry run to like now.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Ben, other Ben. I'm CTO for Vulkan Labs, and I'm going to be talking once again about React and some stuff we do in React. So who is we? We is Vulkan Labs and our clients and myself and my colleagues. Before we start, pro tip, in Google Slides, if you press L, you get a little laser pointer, which is really useful sometimes for certain slides, and we'll be seeing it crop up. Motivation for this talk. So I've been doing this for a while, and I feel like React is approaching a point of much more serious maturity than it has had in the past. Not that React hasn't been a mature framework, but like there are very established patterns that you see repeating and like having serious mind share. So I'm not going to be going over everything I've seen and do. I'm going to be going over some high productivity things that really affect the way that we structure and interact with our applications. This is also not meant to be a 60-minute lecture. It's probably going to be 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how fast I talk, because it's stressful. Sometimes I talk faster. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We're going to go through some things. So the first thing I want to touch on is how we structure our React projects. And this is a very contentious subject. I know that there's approximately 1 billion blog posts about like what directory structure and application structure in a React application should look like. And I have one fundamental problem with almost all of them. I think calling a directory components in a React application is really silly, because everything except library code and maybe some hooks and maybe context is already a component. So if all your things are components and you create a directory called components, what are the other directories? It's confusing. It doesn't make sense to me. So I like to call that components, that like dumping ground directory, I like to call shared or common, because that makes a lot more sense for someone coming into the code base and they see, oh, this is the shared stuff, or this is the common functionality, rather than just components, which could be anything. I break this rule for context though, because they're special and I haven't found a better word than like a directory called context. Let's also think about how we structure our applications, right? So the majority of our websites and line of business applications are made out of pages. I've seen people call them scenes. I've seen people call them screens, but they're made out of pages. And when a developer comes onto an application and they start working with an application, they're going to interact with the app itself and go like, oh, there's this route on this page, and then try to jump into the code and see where this page is coming from. And I've seen many React apps where the fastest way to do that is to copy some copy on the page, Control-Shift-F, enter, and try to find the page. If we had a directory structure that reflects the way you think about the app when interacting with it, it's going to be a lot easier for discoverability. So that's pretty much what I said. Take advantage of a pages directory. Each pages directory can have sub-pages, and you should put common functionality into these pages, and we'll look at what that looks like in a second. What does it look like in practice? Well, here I have a little VS Code open. I hope everyone can see all right. It might be a little bit small, but we have the mentioned common directory here, and right now it's just a button, but it could eventually be like modal and form and accordion and typography and whatever. And then we have our contexts. We're going to look at why I believe in an API context in a little bit. Then we have our library code, which would be things like utilities and our actual API code and all that kind of stuff. And then we have our pages, and I have these wonderful names for them, 1 and 2, instead of picking a practical example. But you can see page 1 has a grid and page 2 has a form. And what we're doing here is we're grouping together things that belong together. So similar to how JSX came around and we said, you know what, we want our markup and our logic to be a bit closer to each other. And then styled components came around and we wanted our CSS to be a bit closer. We can put our code closer to each other as well. So in the case of the form, its schema and its component live together, and then the page has a form, maybe another one. And that's basically what I recommend as a directory structure. I'm going to pause for questions.
Nothing has come up in the chat yet, but if you guys have any questions, please feel free to post them.
I obviously have a million, so I might fire one off. So would these actually reflect like your URL routes?
Yes, that's the idea.
Okay.
The idea is that, like, that's why I have this on the side here, is that your route would go to a page, and then sub routes would have their little subfolders, similar to what Next.js does.
So yeah, like so I know Gatsby also does it, and it calls it pages. Last time I used Gatsby. But I think the problem that I've always had with that approach is that at some point you want to like start, like at some point, especially if you have like a very complex page, you start having so many files kind of in that folder, and you want to start like grouping them together in like a helpers folder or something. And like now you're kind of no longer following that, like kind of connection with kind of a folder corresponding to a route. If I'm understanding correctly in terms of what you're advocating for here. And I think that's something I've always kind of felt was a bit of a tension when I was taking this type of approach.
Yeah, so you take it as far as you can, and then when the rule of three comes in, you pull it up to a common directory or whatever. So the rule of three, for those who don't know, is generally the recommendation is that the third time you do the same thing, you create an abstraction for it. You make it dry, because doing the same thing twice is kind of okay, and you still don't have enough knowledge to know how to properly create an abstraction. But on the third attempt of doing the same thing, you create an abstraction for it. So to answer Skull's question, I would say rule of three it, and then pull it up into something like a common directory or a service component directory, or anything like that. Okay.
So we have a couple of questions from the chat as well.
Okay.
Dominica asks, what if we need a form and it might be on multiple pages? I don't know if you feel your rule of three answer applies to that as well.
Yes and no. So if the form is for exactly the same thing, so let's say you have a form to update people, then that can go into a shared directory, like right under pages or under common. You would put your shared form. If its functionality is 100% the same. Otherwise, you deconstruct it and build up composable units that you can put into a common directory and then pull down into the app. But that's a very good question. And I think, yeah, generally rule of three, but if it's exactly the same thing, pull it up to a shared directory.
Awesome. And then Ajit, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asks, what is the advantage of a JSX extension rather than a JS extension?
You mean TSX or JSX? So .jsx, I don't see the modern build chains actually differentiate between JSX and JS anymore. In the case of VS Code, the language server for TSX and TS is actually a different language server, as far as I understand it, or a different component of the same language server. For JS, it uses the same one. So regardless of if you're in JSX or JS, it's a thing from a bygone era when Webpack had to know what the difference was between a JS and a JSX file. People still prefer having JSX files just to indicate that they do contain JSX.
Cool. And then we have one more question from Martin. He asks, so if we have a home page, we would nest our files in that, such as a banner, but then we change the home page to have something else and move the banner to another page like products. Doesn't it end up being a bit of a challenge given the above?
I think this is a similar question to the first one. Yeah, rule of three it and pull it into a shared directory if it's used in a lot of places. I mean, when it comes to visual design components, you don't really have to rule of three it that much because that actually belongs in a design system. And I'd always question if they are functionally the same thing. So in the case of a banner, maybe it actually belongs in the layout instead of on the page itself, unless it's like a section of some sort. But yeah, I'm not saying don't extract things into common directories. I'm just saying try to keep things together as far as possible. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I actually linked to an article like on this specifically in the text chat that I think kind of played a big role in kind of how I approach these type of things. It's pretty old now. It's from like 2016. But essentially, it comes down to the following rule of thumb that duplication isn't necessarily always the best thing. Duplication has its own problems. There's a reason why things like dry exist, and we try and avoid duplication. But we have to be honest that duplication is what's that line? Let me actually open up that article. I think it's something to do with like duplication is less expensive than the wrong abstraction. Although duplication has its own problems and causes issues, it doesn't cause nearly as much issues as abstracting something too early when you don't really know if it's actually going to be reused all over the place. Yeah, so that's kind of my rule of thumb, but it's by no means a solved problem from where I'm at.
And then kind of the last thing that this allows for is when you do asynchronous imports and code splitting, the build chain has a much easier time of figuring out how to code split stuff if you co-locate like that. Yeah, next up, we use context for dependency injection. So I am fully aware that context has always supposed to have been a dependency injection method. Even before we had this incarnation of context, we had the previous incarnation of context, and that was also for dependency injection. But if I talk to React developers out in the wild and I go, I've been asked a few times, like, how do I do dependency injection in a React app? And the answer is just context. Context isn't just for sharing global state, it's for injecting dependencies. So in practice, let's say I have an API that requires a token to operate. I would see the following kind of code a lot. So you have some component that fetches stuff. You have a hook of some sort to get the token from your authentication store, and this is usually asynchronous. So either there's a is loading that comes back with the token, or the token is just undefined until it's available. And then you have to do trickery like this and wait for the token to become available and pass it down to your API every single call. And that's really frustrating. So what can we do about that? Well, you don't have to repeat this nonsense everywhere. You can make a hook that is similar to this called use API. And that API hook will inject the token for you. And the way we do that is with a combination of a service component and the context. and you'll see there's a bunch of stuff happening here. So the simplest thing to look at is the API context provider. It uses the token and passes it down to a constructor for your entire API and puts it in context. The use API hook is just use context, API context. And this is a pattern that I'm seeing a lot as well, is people don't use context in their components. They create a hook for components of that context. And I think Kenzie Dodds actually popularized this pattern. And then at the top here, we have what I call a service component. And this service component is a God component. So what it does is it calls this use token hook, which asynchronously fetches the token. While it doesn't have a token, it shows loading. While it does, it renders its children. And in at my application, I put that at the lowest level I possibly can, but at a generally high level around whatever my API context provider is, because this God will guarantee that this token is always available. This God guarantees this token is always available. And that's very important. And then inside of my fetcher component, similar to the one we just looked at earlier, I can just use my API and it's already aware of its context, which is a token. And when you do this kind of thing, it's called dependency injection. You're providing contextual and factory built things to your functions. Deep breath. Any questions there?
So what exactly is the dependency that you're injecting here? Is it the token? Is it the API?
It's the API with the token.
And the API, is that stateless, or do you actually have state in there, or is it just kind of actual stateless functions?
Well, the API carries state, which is the token, right? And I'll in the live section of this, maybe we can actually code this out a little bit more, so it becomes a little bit more obvious what's going on.
So I tend to do something similar with kind of like a create API factory function that I just pass down through context. And I've always been a bit hesitant to actually put state in my context. But I think that's maybe just, it seems like that's not as bad as it used to be in the early days of React. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, but it was very much frowned upon. Like in the very early days, it does seem like, I don't know whether people have just accepted it or whether, like, for whatever reason, the performance implications aren't that bad anymore and so forth. But I'm super interested in maybe exploring that a bit, as you mentioned, a bit later.
We have state for days in our context. State for days. We can have a chat about that another time. Maybe that's a slide now. Maybe that's a new slide. State for days in context. Cool. So similar to that token guard, in every single application we work in, we have this pattern we call the login guard. God spelled wrong there. It looks something like this. So if any of you use Auth0 for your authentication, you'll be very familiar with login with redirect because the only way you can authenticate is with a login with redirect. And that sends you away from the application and then brings you back to the application. This use effect you can pretty much ignore, but it handles that logic. And then this service component, login guard, checks whether the user is authenticated. If they are authenticated, render the children. Otherwise, render a loading spinner. And this goes at the very, very top level of your application. It guards the login. And you can make all kinds of guards for your application. You can have guards for authorization. You can have guards for certain data sets that have to be loaded. You can have all kinds of guards, and this is called a service component. Not to be confused with a service component that purely returns null. So there's also a school of people who call service components components that return null and just have side effects. That is also a service component. Questions there, or can I move on to React Query?
We have one question from the previous section. Divi asks, loving the DI idea to use with context. Why not just make a call at the start and add the token as a default bearer in, for example, Axios?
Oh, that's a very deep philosophical question. Because not everyone uses Axios in the first place. So what you're doing is you're doing a different kind of dependency injection there. You're creating a singleton, right? You're creating the Axios singleton, and you're utilizing the way that modules work in JavaScript, and modules are loaded in JavaScript. I.e., when you create or export a thing, it's a singleton. And all state inside of a module is also persisted. Now, singletons are messy at best because you never have a guarantee of state with a singleton. You can never guarantee that the singleton has actually run everything it needs to run to set itself and its state up, unless you do some kind of voodoo magic from main down. Whereas with dependency injection, you are guaranteed that the singleton objects in dependency injection will be well formed. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. We also have one more question from the chat where Martin asks, is there a place where a person can find all of these design patterns in one place?
No. It's lots of Google, lots of Hacker News, lots of React status. I've been meaning to write a blog for the last 10 years. Maybe I'll get to it soon. But React Status is a newsletter that I highly recommend you subscribe to. You can find a lot of these conversations and these patterns and practices in there. Also, keeping track of React topics on Hacker News is highly recommended. That's Login God. And then something that is very near and dear to my heart is that we use something called React Query for server-side state management. So in the beginnings, in the long ago, we had Redux and we had Flux. Can anyone remember like Flux before Redux was a thing? That was a special time. But these were state management solutions. They still are. Redux is still around. Many other state management solutions are still around, MobX and such. And what if you've written a few line of business React applications, what 80% of your state management code is managing, this is what my state is on the server side, this is what my state is on the client side. I need to synchronize these two things. I need to make sure they're the same. And to do that in most state management frameworks is a lot of boilerplate code over and over and over again. Less so now that we have patterns to deal with these things and we are getting more standardized APIs and stuff, but lots of boilerplate code. React Query just makes that all melt away. And so let's look at React Query. So this little thingy here, this is React Query in action. This is a hook called useQuery. It takes 3 arguments, 3 parameters. The first one is its query key. The second one is the function it uses, the asynchronous function it uses to fetch data. And the third argument, which is not present here, is an object of configuration and extra parameters. So the important thing to note here is this query key. It's what React Query uses to essentially cache and identify API calls or asynchronous calls. If I come into this component, this person component, with an ID, right? And ID is 1. It's going to go into useQuery. ID is 1. It's going to call fetch person with that ID, populate its cache for ID 1, and then go through its loading states, error, loading, fetched, all of that, and then display the data that comes back. If I pass ID 2, it invalidates this query and reruns it. If I put 2 person components next to each other and I pass each one of them ID 1, then that query in theory is only going to fire off once. React Query also, if your promise has a .cancel method on it, it will cancel in-flight requests. So if you're using like a board controller or something, it can actually cancel in-flight requests, so you don't have like 50 requests doing the same thing. It'll manage that for you. What's my next example here? Before I move on, are there any questions or statements or anything on React Query so far?
Not at the moment, but we do have one question about the guards, if I can interject it quickly. It says, hello, Ben, regarding guards for checking if the required data is available, would the guard also be required to do the data loading?
It depends. So in most cases, no. I would have something else do the data loading and the guard consume, like either a context or a hook of some sort or some global state from Zustanz or something. I would recommend that the guard itself just checks for the presence of things and maybe triggers fetching, but doesn't do the fetching itself.
Okay, then we have 2 more questions. The first one says, how would you go about aggregating multiple API requests with useQuery?
That's a good question. There are 2 to 3 different ways of doing that. There is like a use multiple query hook, but I think the next example maybe will kind of answer your question, and I'll jump into my editor quickly and show you as well how you can use multiple queries. So React Query is particularly useful for cascading queries. So if you've ever had to do like 3 drop downs or 5 drop downs under each other where you select the first drop down and then it has to filter the bottom drop down and then that filters the subsequent drop down. That's really hard. Or maybe I'm just stupid. But that's generally quite hard. So with React Query, it's quite simple. So you'll see I'm getting my list of companies here as my first query. As my second query, I'm passing the company as a dependency to this query and telling this query to only run once it has a company ID available to it, and then fetch departments for that company. And then the same thing for people dependent on department, fetch for that department. And then I just check if any of them are errored out or loading and then render the dropdowns. So this is cascading stuff or dependent queries. And dependent queries are just so nice to have a working example of. And like a well thought out API. Next up, the last thing we're going to talk about in React Query before I jump into my editor is Invalidate Query. So I have 2 components here. I have person, which we saw earlier, that just fetches a person by ID and then displays their name. And then I have a form that has what's called a mutation from React Query, and this will just update the person when you mutate. But what I want you to check here is on success of this mutation, I call the query client, and the query client is the like wrapping singleton thing that React Query uses to cache and configure itself and invalidate and do all those things. The query client, I tell it to invalidate person at ID. So no matter how deeply into the app person form is and how detached it is from person display itself, when I invalidate queries for person, it's going to go to every use query that is for that person. Only if there are many, it'll only run the query once and then provide to every use query dependent on that person, the new person. And I think that's really powerful. I think that's really cool. Let me just jump into my editor real quick to talk about doing multiple queries. So let's say we have fetch data 1, and then we have fetch data 2.
Ben, I think there was a request if you can maybe just zoom in a little bit.
Zoomy. Better?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, so there's 2 hooks, use queries and use query. So option 1 you have is to use query with a cache key and just to promise .all your multiple calls. That's one option. The other option is to use the use queries hook, and I need to familiarize myself with it really quickly again. Use queries. Oh, it's just a list. And then query key, Yeah, so you just do multiple queries like this. Key picture. Think something like this. Yeah, I would check React React Queries docs, but I don't want to go to my browser. Yeah, there's a use queries hook for multiple queries, or you can just utilize promise.all. Okay. Does that kind of answer your question? Not so great.
I think that explains it pretty well. Before you move on, we also had one more question about React Query. Dominica asks, is this something separate from Next.js, or does Next.js implement React Query?
It is separate from Next.js. Completely independent. It's written by someone called Tanner Lindsay, who also wrote React Table and React Charts. Both wonderful libraries. Okay, I need to go a little bit faster. We're running towards the end of time. We also use something called Zustanz for global state. We don't use Redux unless we absolutely have to. And when we absolutely have to is generally under two conditions. One, when you need time travel. Redux is really, really good at time travel. And the second is when you have deeply nested object trees that need key updates that are dependent on actions being able to update multiple keys at the same time, or deeply nested keys performantly. So we don't generally use Redux, we use Zustanz, and Zustanz looks something like this. This is the Zustanz constructor over here. There's some TypeScript stuff going on here, but it takes a function with a setter that returns an object. So in this case, it returns an organization and a function to select an organization that will go and fetch the organization for you, and accepts an ID and then sets that value back onto itself. Now, let's look at how that is nifty and useful. This gives you back a hook that you can use anywhere in your application. So let's say we have the classic thing where in our sidebar, we can click to select an organization that we want. So like either I'm on my Vulkan Labs organization, or I'm on my personal organization, or I'm on my New Media Labs organization. Very classic thing, and the entire app needs to know about that to be able to do stuff, right? To scope everything it does. So we make this singleton here, the Zustanz singleton, and then you use it, you get back the object that you've defined here. So the selected organization and a method to select the organization. And then we have a sidebar of some sort with a header and then a select list with all of the organizations. And the selected one is the organization from the hook. And when we change it, we select the value from the options list. I can go into Zustanz a lot more, but I just wanted to quickly go over it in this talk. Questions? Next button. Zustanz is also super useful when you want to do stuff outside of the React state tree. So let's say we have some kind of Axios or fetch base, base function that handles all of our common cases. We can, let's say I have a store for toasts. I can call use toast store dot set state, import it from that singleton, and then add whatever I need to it. So really useful for, and I mean Redux has always done this, right? You can dispatch from anywhere, and that's why it's so powerful. But a lot of the other state management libraries don't really allow you to dispatch from outside of the component tree. Zustanz does, React does, Redux does, MobX does. Yeah. Finally, we use Formic, and I'm going to get people throwing fire at me for this. But we use Formic instead of the myriad other libs. We used to use Final Form. We have tried to use React Hook Form and all the other various incantations of hook-based form libraries. We don't do the hook-based ones for one reason, and that is when you have deeply nested custom controls. Formic, this form object that you use to set up a form, is a context provider. So when in a deeply nested, so we have a deeply nested custom control. This could be 10 layers deep. This could be 20 layers deep. We could be building some kind of wizard form. We can then use the context. We can leverage the context of the form through the use field and use format context hooks. And to make like a custom select list, here we're making a custom select list for organizations, is really as simple as going use field can be spread onto any input. It has an on change, a value, a name, and I think a label. No, it doesn't have label. Does it? I can't remember. This is why we use Formic, because you can really do powerful things inside of deeply nested forms that you can't with other libraries that don't use context providers. Questions?
We have a question again about React Query. Matt asks, with regards to using React Query, if you delete an item in a paginated list, how do you go about invalidating queries efficiently to prevent marking previous items as stale?
Deleting items in paginated lists. Well, you wouldn't necessarily know which page that item is on. So in React Query, there's this thing called use infinite query. I would suggest you go look at that. That pretty much answers your question. We're running low on time, so I'm gonna hurry through the last few slides.
I maybe have a quick one for you before you do that. You can just
Sure.
give me a quick answer. Do you ever do forms where the actual inputs themselves are uncontrolled and you get the values on submit?
Yes, I have done that when I'm not using a form library.
Is it? Okay. Yeah, like the reason why I'm just asking is I've been doing that more and more nowadays. Just because like I don't know, like I'm just so tired of React forms where like as you enter it just becomes so sluggish and like you can see like the entire state just update with every key press. Yeah, no, I was just curious.
Okay. React hook form does that, I think. Anyway, it uses refs.
Cool. I'll
We
check it
still
out.
use React. We still use React Router mostly because people are familiar with it and it gets the job done. The recent API changes have been jarring, to say the least, but welcome. We use Vite now instead of Create React App or the other options, maybe SWC at some point, but Vite. Um, it's fast. It answers 90% of what we needed to answer. It allows you to do legacy browser builds. If you don't need to do fancy Webpack stuff like federation, I would highly, highly recommend you move your applications over to Vite instead of Create React App. It also uses ESBuild. So a Create React app of ours that took 40 seconds to hot reload in Create React App takes 300 milliseconds to reload using Vite and ESBuild.
Would you prefer Vite over Next?
Well, they're different things, right? Next is a framework, and Vite is just a scaffold.
But so you wouldn't include some type of pre-rendering or something with Vite. You just use it as a single page app.
Yeah, just use it as a single page app. I feel very strongly about like Next.js and Remix and that kind of stuff. Really great for websites, not great for line of business applications. Line of business applications are fine without server-side rendering. They just need to be single page apps that get the job done.
All hate mail too. What did you say your email address is again?
Yeah, all hate mail.
Send it to other Ben.
I didn't say that Next and Remix and those things are bad. I think there are amazing frameworks, and I think that especially Remix with its edge running stuff is game changing. But I don't think it lends itself to line of business applications. We've done a lot of questions. We've done a little bit of live coding. Unless there are other questions, okay, thanks, bye. Get in touch with me on zatech@otherben. Email me or send all your hate mail to benyannika@gmail.com. Or if you want to contract me or any of my lovely colleagues at Vulkan Labs, you can also get in touch with us there. Okay.
Cool. Thanks so much. Do you have time for some Q&A or do you need to head out?
I have 8 minutes.
Okay. You guys heard the man.
No, it's not 7:30 yet, so I have 9 minutes.
So, yeah, as always, questions are more than welcome in the text chat. I'm going to just take the opportunity to slip in a couple of my own while we're waiting for other questions. So, do you use something like Storybook at all?
Oh, me. Yeah, all the time.
Have you found that things like React Query and so forth sometimes don't play nice with, for example, Storybook?
State doesn't belong in Storybook. Everything should be stateless in your Storybook. No application logic.
So would you include actual view specific state and not actual view model?
No. So like dumb components.
Okay,
Storybook
so
is for dumb components.
Okay, so you'd go full on just static output.
Yeah. Okay. And that's my opinion, man. That's just my opinion, man.
No, that's very clear. But yeah, no. So I've kind of swung between the two quite a bit. But I always find it hard. At some point, even something like a drop down needs like some type of, even if it's super localized state. So if you have like all of that stateless, then it's like, I think, like, for me, I found that the problem is sometimes treating your view and your UI as purely stateless means that you're kind of at danger of kind of separating some of that state a bit too much, and kind of having it be a bit too close to like the actual data itself. But yeah, it's hard to talk about these things in the abstract, but I was just curious.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Thanks, Debbie.
Okay. No, it doesn't seem that way.
Swag time. Swag time. Swag time. Swag time.
Justin, the people have spoken.
Hi, everyone. I've been lurking in the background. I have already posted the link to the Offers End giveaway in the chat, but I'll just post it again. You can just hit this URL and you need to fill in a little form. And the unlimited entries, I mean, you can only enter once, but everyone who's watching can enter, and they do a random draw, and then they'll get in touch with you if you are one of the lucky recipients. And you will get a t-shirt and a bunch of stickers in the post, delivered to your home. Cool.
Now we're probably going to see people like drop off like flies now that the swag code has been given.
How many people were we at peak, by the way?
I think like above 40.
40,
Yeah, I
yeah.
saw 43 at one point.
Yeah.
Gadoof, 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 gadoof.
Which is, I think, more than we've ever like done for like in person. No, that's not fair of me to say. But I see there's just one question there that kind of popped up at the end there. I don't know if you maybe have time to unpack this, Ben. Mandia, do you maybe want to share that one?
Sure. Dylan asks, how different is React's ES6 syntax when compared to ES5?
Very. Yeah, so like the big difference also is the JSX syntax to obfuscate the React.create elements stuff away into HTML tags. But your big differences are going to be in arrow functions, destructuring, spreading, and pretty soon we're going to have pattern matching and records, which is going to be amazing.
I think it's also just important to make a distinction that like ES5, ES6, ES7, like those are in no way actually tied to React. Those are kind of separate JavaScript syntaxes, and React just obviously the more recent syntax you use, obviously the powerful React is going to be. But because React is just written in JavaScript, like those obviously influence how we write or React, but they are not React specific in any way. Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, I've got to do the sponsor thing. So Vulcan Labs is obviously hiring. We're always hiring. We have a salary range of between 30,000 to 120,000 Rand a month. We are looking for senior, intermediate to senior React, TypeScript, Node.js, SQL developers. And you can contact me at ben.janecke@vulcanlabs.com. Thank you, everyone. Plug over.
No, by all means. Yeah. So it's maybe if it isn't clear. Ben and the Vulcan Labs team is completely sponsoring this kind of React Africa stuff. So it's 100% driven by them. So please, like, if you enjoy this, support them. Like, they are a really great company. Mandia also works for them. I have several friends who've actually worked with them. I would actually do some work for them as well if I had capacity. But yeah, great company. Definitely check them out. Like, both Ben and Mandy are very involved with the community. Cool. I think that about covers it. Justin, do we have any announcements?
Just that we are planning a weekend of code over 2 Sundays with the other radio, a community radio station in Cape Town. And we'll be posting about that and announcing it next week sometime. So have a look out for that. Usual channels in the Slack and on Meetup.
Other radio not at all related to Other Ben, by the way.
Not that we are aware.
Cool, yeah. So, Mandia, do you want to kind of end us off?
Yeah, just thanks so much for that, Ben. We really appreciate you speaking here, and I think we've all gained some really valuable insights into some cool modern day React tricks. So yeah, I hope that someday we can convince you to speak for us again. And thanks for everybody who attended as well. It was great to see the turnout here, and stay posted. We'll be having some more great events in the future.
Cool. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, bye.